Metro Louisville is made up of 26 districts. This podcast gives you a chance to connect with your council member and learn about what's going down in your district. Welcome to District Download. I'm Katrina Helmer, and joining me today, another new face, Councilman Mark Fox from District 13. Welcome to District Download.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here, and thank you for coming and putting this together for us.
There's a level of expectation here because I know you have some history when it comes to media and knowing your way around a microphone.
Got a great face for radio.
So this is your launch into podcasting now.
Launch into podcasting.
I think it'll be good. So each time we have a new council member onto the podcast, we like to start out with a little bio. And then I know you have a topic that you've been really intrigued by, that you have some guests in here with us today that you guys will be talking about. But first, let's get to know Councilman Mark Fox a little better. Councilman, what is your district? What area is that?
Well, I'm very honored to represent District 13, which is in South Louisville, and it encompasses the neighborhoods which people will be more familiar with and giving you the boundaries. Scottsdale neighborhood, part of Okolona, the Fairdale community, and the Jefferson Memorial Forest, where we have 7,100 acres of beautiful foliage this time of year. So I can save you the drive to Gatlinburg and Brown County by just going around the block and seeing JMF and all of its fall beauty.
And this is an area you are familiar with. You've spent a lot of time living in District 13 before becoming the council member.
I have. I was actually hail from the Pleasure Ridge Park area and got on the former Jefferson County Police Department at the age of 18. And one of our guests today at Brote was my very first sergeant at 18 years of age. I went to work for Ed and ended up retiring about 35 years later as a district commander for the area that I now represent on the Metro Council, which is something I'm very proud of. So lifetime of service in one iteration or another, all right in that area.
Now, how long have you been on council?
I'm coming up on the end of my first term. It's pretty amazing. 4 years have gone by really, really quickly. And I'm a guy that subscribes to term limits, and I still do, to be quite honest. I will term limit myself, but there's a big learning curve with these jobs. So, at about the 3-year mark, I was feeling pretty confident in what I was doing and being able to serve my people most effectively. And this year, I was honored by my colleagues to be named the chairman of the Public Safety Committee, which is a huge thing. And so I'm going to run for re-election so I can get some time in that seat because it may not happen again for a District 13 council person. And that's probably the second, well, I would say the second most powerful committee on the council. The first being budget, the second being the entity that spends 84% of the general fund revenue budget, and that's police, fire, EMS, Metro Safe, corrections, and emergency management, the things that mean the most in people's lives citywide, not just in District 13, but across this community. That's a big concern for folks right now, and that's what led us to the topic we have today.
And you've hinted at it a little bit, and so I prepped you for this question before we started. But why? Why did you want to change things up in your life and become a council member when you first ran?
Well, as I said, I retired from a career and a lifetime of being a police officer in 2015. I felt I still had some gas left in the tank that I could make a positive change in my community and have a positive influence on it and kind of raise the bar on it a little bit. And I believe my career set me up perfectly for the time that we're in because I know from the bottom to the top of a police agency how to run it because with the exception of working narcotics, I've done pretty much everything else from, frankly, the janitor up to the second in command, third in command. So I understand the administrative side. I understand the operational side. I understand the challenges of being a police officer. And, it's an interesting look inside that life for people that haven't gotten to experience it before, when I talk to community groups and when I talk to various clubs and organizations. I had one last night, and they weren't really interested in me as their councilman. They wanted to hear about my law enforcement career, which I'm always happy to share because it is interesting. I mean, they make movies and write books and about law enforcement, and understand that people have a vested interest in that, and hopefully I can serve and represent the agencies that we have in a very positive way.
Now, that leads in perfectly, what you're saying.
Perfectly.
To your topic, to your guests here today. So I'm going to toss it over to you. Introduce who do we have here in this podcast room today, and what can we expect as listeners to hear about?
Well, thank you very much, Katrina. I appreciate you kicking things off. Today we're going to talk about GVI, which is the Group Violence Intervention Program. The city of Louisville partnered with John Jay College, which is in Midtown Manhattan, and a criminologist / professor named David Kennedy. David Kennedy wrote a book in 2013 called Hands Up, Don't Shoot, or something to that effect. And that morphed into a program that attacks violent behavior and has been very, very successful, showing drops in violent crime across America in large cities, small ones as well. The city of Boston was the first place it was implemented, and that was in the mid to late 90s. And after about 2-3 years into the program, they showed a 63% drop in violent crime and shootings. The closest place to Louisville to show success to this point has been Cincinnati, and they experienced a 41% drop in violent crime and in gun crime involving groups, gangs. Today with us is Ed Brote. Ed was a former captain on the Jefferson County Police Department, and he went into academia, as did Tracy Schiller, who is our other guest. Tracy, in his last stop, was chief of the Elizabethtown Police Department. So I'm going to toss it first to Ed, and if you would just give us a quick bio, your background, what brought you to this point, because I know you guys have taught and instructed and been involved at the ground floor of GVI programs.
Well, like most people, you start at the bottom in the policing. I started as a Kentucky State Trooper, transferred up to Jefferson County Police, finished a career out there, and was a chief of police in Anchorage for a few years. And then I got hired, along with Tracy, by the Regional Community Policing Institute here in Kentucky, which is a subsidiary of the COPS office back when they had these community policing institutes. And as a result of being in the Regional Community Policing Institute, we were exposed to national level programs that were based in research. And I never saw those kinds of things when I was a policeman at the local level. And that led me into being involved in implementing some of these programs in the state of Kentucky.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your service. And I'll add one thing about Ed's career that he's too humble to discuss. But when I started working for Ed, he was recovering from a gunshot wound that he received in service to this community out off Brownsboro Road, right at Goose Creek Road. It brought home to me as a young 18-year-old, seeing my sergeant in a cast and a sling from a gunshot wound, the dangers of the job and the dangers that men and women in law enforcement face on a daily basis. So, Ed, it can't go unsaid. We as a community appreciate your service, appreciate your sacrifice, and can't say thank you enough. Tracy?
Yeah, great. So, well, first of all, it's been a real honor to work with this man, Ed Brote, throughout the years. So he's been a bit of a mentor to me as well. But so I started my policing career in 1978. I worked for a small community here in Jefferson County, but then spent a number of years in Shelbyville. Then went to Louisville Division of Police. And retired there in 2003. And then from that point, Ed and I worked very closely together with the Regional Community Policing Institute. And as he mentioned, we really got exposed to some fantastic programs that many of which we wish were still around, quite honestly. Yeah. And this became one of them, right on the kind of the outskirts there. And we got associated with David Kennedy through a mutual friend. And Gary Cordner, who was a professor at Eastern Kentucky University, and actually he was a dean there at one point in time. But the opportunities to work within the context of those programs was great. So, and I know Ed will probably talk more about those as we go.
Great. I am invested with GVI. I read the book before GVI and Louisville were mentioned in the same sentence. Probably about 4 years ago is when I first became acquainted with the book. And, I saw the successes in High Point and in Baltimore, in Cincinnati. And we've been involved now for 2 years in Louisville, and I'm just not seeing the good results that these other cities have. And I think there's a disconnect there somewhere. I really do. And I think at some point and Ed and I had this discussion earlier, when you have a disconnection, it's generally at the leadership level. So as a city leader, I feel it's incumbent on me to take the reins where I can and make this thing a success. Can you guys kind of walk me through what you saw in Cincinnati and what does a successful GVI program look like?
I think those statistics tell you what they look like. They had a 41% reduction in violent crime. That's significant on anybody's charts. And to get there, you would think it would take some monumental changes in how you structure your services and the particular techniques and how you apply them and the strategies. But the interesting thing about GVI is it really doesn't take that deep of a restructuring process. It does take quite a bit of coordinated work between different entities. So I'll tell you one of the things that really impressed me, and I had the opportunity to sit down with David Kennedy directly and talk to him about this, as well as Chief Stryker in Cincinnati. And, their initial planning was done in a very, I thought it was a spectacular manner. But the most impressive thing was that first call-in, when they had about a dozen of these folks that have been people that are playing key parts in most of the violence taking place in that community, came in and sat down and listened to the message. That was probably one of the most impressive pieces that I got a chance to witness.
Thank you. Ed, can you, for our listeners, we don't want to go too deep in the pool, quite frankly, because a lot of folks watching this podcast aren't really going to know the layers of GVI. So can you give us GVI 101 and kind of walk us through, there's social service components, there's educational components. Can you kind of walk through those and tell us what a good program looks like?
Yeah, there's most large communities have all the components. They're in existence, they're operating, but they're operating independently of one another. GVI requires a laser focus from each of those components on specifically youth violence, shootings. And each one of those has a role to play. And it's designed to give youth that are participating in these groups, some call them gangs, some call them sets, but they're groups, loosely connected or tightly connected. But it gives them an opportunity to escape the street life. That's the first step. If they take advantage of it, they're mentored, they're counseled, they're lined up with jobs, training, even relocation in some cases. If they don't take advantage of it, they're told that there will be repercussions, unlike they've had before. In traditional programs, the police investigate each individual offense as an individual offense. Under GVI, if you're part of a group and there's a shooting that takes place and the police can tie that shooting to a particular group, the message is the police are going to come after everybody in that group, right? So it could be for a parole violation. It could be for illegal parking. It could be for failure to pay child support. Anything that is a criminal offense, they're going to focus on people in that group. So what that does is it changes the peer pressure. Under the current setting, if we're all in a group and somebody insults me or makes a play for my girlfriend, all of my peers encourage me to take revenge in the form of shooting. the dynamic that takes place in this is once they understand that if I shoot somebody, they're coming after all of you, then the peer pressure is, Ed, we'll get even, but we're not going to be shooting anybody. So the peer pressure changes from shooting to not shooting. And that's why you see these drastic reductions.
It's really based upon the whole notion of what drives the change, and it's group dynamic. In the past, and you'll remember this, Mark, in the past, we capture somebody that was involved in this type of an incident. We bring him in, we take him out of the environment, we bring him in, we set him down, and we give them all these resources, and we tell them what's going to happen if they don't change. And then we take them, and they might be all on board, right? And then we take them and put them right back in that same environment with the same types of pressures and we would expect change to take place. That was an unrealistic expectation. So what David did is says, look, this is driven by this group pressure, so we need to affect how the group looks at the issues and how it affects them directly, and they will create the change if we provide the context properly.
Yeah, that's an excellent recap of GVI. And so our listeners understand the programs and things they've heard of here in Louisville that are involved with this is, first of all, the faith community, of the education community. It acts almost as a force multiplier, if you will, to the police. Ocean, the Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, gets involved to provide the services to these largely young men, and educational opportunities, food opportunities, housing opportunities. You also get buy-in from the prosecutors at all levels, from the local level, the county attorney, to the state prosecutors, Tom Wine's office, Commonwealth, and even the federal courts, because oftentimes in these gun crimes, the penalty phase is more enhanced by going federal than by taking it through a state charge. So the U.S. Attorney of the Western District is on board with this, as is probation and parole, as is LMPD. And like I say, the key is the community, because a lot of the folks in the community have lost children to gun violence, or have lost a brother or a sister to gun violence. So it kind of dovetails into what we've seen in the judiciary with restorative justice, to be honest. These services, these things are offered to these young men to get out of the life of violent crime. They'll have the support of their community through the faith-based folks, and through the victims' families of other victims. So once they turn their head away from that and a gun goes off, then the wrath of local government, state government, and federal government comes down upon them and their group. And frankly, here in Louisville, that's where I see the disconnect, to be honest. Now, I may be wrong in that assumption. I'm going to have a special committee meeting of the Public Safety Committee, just a matter of getting all the players in the same room, because there is a disconnect. We're not seeing 63% drop like Boston had, 42% like Stockton, California had, or 41% like our sister city up the river had. So we've got to we've got to find the fix and move forward with this program until somebody tells me of a better one, because absent GVI, I've not heard of anything to attack our violent crime problem. And we already are sitting on 130 deaths this year. We had 179 at the end of last year. And, one is inexcusable. One is somebody's son. One is somebody's brother. One is a future leader of our community. And we've got to find a way to disconnect that supply chain, quite frankly. So what, on the peer pressure side, I think that's very interesting, because that's something in the age groups we see, and we don't know who the suspects are in about 70% of them, because there haven't been arrests made. But you can kind of look at the victim, and you can look at their demographic, their age, and you can kind of draw from that. We were all pretty, I'll say this with a bit of, I'll say you this, you two guys were good detectives. I was mediocre at best. But when you don't have a suspect, you look at your victim and you kind of draw some conclusions around that. If it's a middle-aged male, you're going to look at his wife, or vice versa. But when we're seeing victims 15, 16, 17, that means our suspect is got a pretty good shot of being in that same age range. That age range, peer pressure is huge. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think, that, and the statistics and the data prove that out time and time again. You were talking about these successes, those weren't by mistake. And you had mentioned, the value of leadership and success, and I can't overstate that. I think that is absolutely key. And you're getting, all these different entities have got to work together in a very unified fashion. Someone has to be the person that makes that happen, right? So they have to be able to bring these people together, have these honest conversations, talk about successes and failures as they move forward, reassess time and time again, and keep the program on track. So that's one of the things, obviously, I would say we want to look at.
Yeah. I'll describe a call-in to you. And so you can see how the components kind of work together. So you have this call-in, and it's mandatory based on their restrictions in probation and parole. You say you might invite 30 or 40 in. You have to be here this night at this time at this place. And they all come in. And they have the faith-based, they have family members, victims of shootings, they have social services, they have employment opportunities, they have old gangsters that have reformed. And each one of those groups makes a presentation. And it's fairly scripted on what their role is in getting this message across. We went to a couple of those in Cincinnati, and I remember this one night when the police were the last to go, and I think it was the faith-based that went just before the police, and it kind of reached a crescendo. And when he said, "If you want out of the street life, stand up now," I'm telling you, there were about 6 to 8 of these young people that jumped out of their chair, that wanted out of the street life. And they immediately ushered them away and took them over to another room and started the process of getting them out of the street life. And then the police made their presentation, and it was. And here's the thing, there's a lot of research that goes in before you do this. The police should already know who are in some of these groups. They should have some video and photos of them on the street corner gathering together, and they should have them identified. And they put this up on a screen, and they say, "We know who you are. We know who you run with. Most of you have a provision in your probation and parole that you can't associate with known felons. Well, look here. There's 3 of you right here in this picture, and that guy's a known felon." Mm-hmm. That's the message that goes out, and it works if everybody does their part. But the call-in is, in my mind, one of the most critical parts of it, because that's how the message gets conveyed. And you don't have everybody in a gang in the room, but the people that are there that night, their role is to take the message to the others in their groups. And they do. I think Cincinnati had some wiretap information where they had group members talking about something that happened. They wanted to take revenge, and they were saying, "Well, we'll do a lot of stuff, but we ain't going to be shooting anybody." So they have evidence that it worked.
That's really cool. That I kind of get mixed messages from a number of different sources, but there is some back and forth as to whether or not you can require somebody that's on probation or on parole to attend these call-ins. It's my belief that a parole agreement or a probation agreement is just that. You can pretty much put whatever you want in it. It's a method to get out of jail. If you don't agree with it, then you simply stay in jail. But I don't have a law degree, and I'm not on the bench. That's not for me to decide. But let me ask you this. Was that a problem in Cincinnati? If they had convicted felons that they wanted to get to call-ins, was that a roadblock for them in the state of Ohio?
It was never mentioned if there was an issue there, and the results, as far as the number of people that showed up at these, wouldn't indicate it was. Now, here's what I'll say. That doesn't have to be the only way to make contact with folks that you want to make contact with. If I recall, Cincinnati also engaged in a more creative way of doing this. They had the call-ins, as Ed just described, but they also had a way where they went to some of these folks' homes, and they carried the same message there. Okay, and the police did this often, and they would sit down and say, "Look, here's your opportunities. And if you don't take advantage of those, and you continue to engage in behavior that you're engaging in, and specifically mention you should outline exactly what behavior you want stopped." And in this case, it was the shooting, right? If it continues, we know who you are. We're going to come after you, basically. That's the idea. Anyway, I think the community has to look at other opportunities as well. The call-in is critical. I think it's good because people need to see themselves in that room and hear the same message together, which is good. But these other messages should be researched and applied when they are most appropriate, for the success. So there has to be some tailoring to anything for the community's sake and what works best. And I know they did that and it worked quite well for them.
That's an interesting point because it was my belief every parole agreement or probation agreement I've seen requires reporting to a parole officer. There's your call in, right? You can do it whenever, wherever, but
Yeah, this month's meeting is going to be here at this time at this place.
Right.
yeah, I would think there are workarounds to get to it.
Yeah.
I'm being given the hook that we're getting close to the end of our podcast. I got to say it went really fast, but can you guys give me in closing just what's one thing that would cause this to not be successful? What you got on that, Ed? You want to take a shot at that one first?
I'm going to give my analogy, Tracy,
Okay, here we go.
on baking a cake.
Yeah.
All right? Coming up Thanksgiving, Aunt Martha used to bake the best German chocolate cake anybody ever tasted. And everybody wants you to repeat that. Aunt Martha's gone, but you have the recipe. And you say, okay, I'll do it. And the recipe calls for 2 cups of sugar, and you only have 1.5. It calls for 2 eggs, and you only have 1. And it calls for a cup of buttermilk, and you have none. But you don't want to run to the grocery store. You say, it'll be okay. That's not that much. It'll be okay. And you bake this cake. Everybody shows up, and they eat the cake, and they say, this isn't the same. It's not the same. Well, the recipe is the same. The recipe must not work, is what you say. Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing with these programs. There are components to them. And if you take a component out or you alter that component to make it easier for you to do, then you're not going to get the same results. And Tracy and I, in the last, how many years? 5 or 6 that we worked, we actually did agency assessments in Kentucky and across the country. And invariably, somebody would say, well, this isn't working, and you'd look at the recipe and you would say, well, you left this out.
Yeah.
It's simple. Follow the recipe and it'll work. Change the recipe and it's not going to work. And I would ask you, if you change something in a recipe, do not blame the program. It's not the program's fault. It's a leadership issue.
That's an excellent point. The easy thing to do is to blame the program. Tracy, any final thoughts?
Oh, I think Ed hit the nail right square on the head. We've seen this a number of times where we've seen programs put in place, and we go in and we assess the outcomes, and of course they didn't match, like they said, but then we'd look at the process, and the process was not as it was designed to be. So that has to be continually reviewed, updated, and close attention has to be paid to it throughout the whole commitment to the program.
Thank you for that, and I want to thank you both for being here, and I want to thank you more importantly for your service to this community. In this room, we probably have well over 100 years of law enforcement experience and service, and I just can't thank you all enough for that, and thank you for being here again. And Ms. Helmer?
We got so much detail within this podcast, honestly. And I truly hope that those who are listening and those who are watching with Metro TV, if you have questions and you're listening, that's what I was going to say. I always put it back to the council member. What should people do when they're listening and they have a question or they have a thought? or they have an idea, or they say, I want this feedback and I want my voice to be heard. What do people need to do now with this information?
They can call my office, 502-574-1113, or they can send an email to mark.fox@louisvilleky.gov. These two guys are friends of mine, and I have their phone numbers, and I can call them anytime if it exceeds my ability to answer their question. I'll call Ed or call Tracy, and we'll get it. And like I said, you hit an excellent point. Our community has great ideas. I hear them all the time about a myriad of things. If you've got an idea how we can lower our homicide numbers, that is government's first role of responsibility, is the protection of its citizens. And it's the highest calling that the three of us have ever had.
I'm going to toss another question out to the table before we wrap up. I also like to bring back in these episodes, what is Metro Council's role? What is your role as well as a leader when it comes to this topic? So I know you mentioned wanting to go ahead and talk about this and bring this back up in committee. What else, Councilman, are we looking at? Is this kind of a review period for you in trying to look at this program and kind of take a pulse check on where we are? Or what are your thoughts on what is Metro Council's role as we move forward with this program?
Well, thank you for that, and I'll take you real quickly back to 7th grade civics. I'm the legislative branch of government, so the entities like Ocean, the Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, the Louisville Metro Police Department, probation and parole, they all work for the executive branch of government, where I play a role is the bully pulpit and the purse strings. We can fund, we can defund, but it takes the executive branch. At the local level, that's the mayor. At the state level, it's the governor. And at the federal level, it's the president. We function very much like the federal government in our three branches of legislative, judicial, and executive. So I will use the pulpit for the time I have it, because in my mind, keeping young men and young women, in some cases, alive is priority one. I mean, none of us like potholes. None of us like our street lights out or our garbage that didn't get picked up. But at the end of the day, with those things, we can get them corrected and nobody's died. And this is a level of seriousness, I believe, that is worthy of me dedicating my time and my life to finding an answer to.
Well, I appreciate everyone in this room for the input that you've had on this conversation, and thank you so much for bringing it to the table, Councilman.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate you being here.